We are going to stop the recording for the Q&A so everyone can feel comfortable to ask the questions that they've got. So thank you for keeping me honest, Evelyn, you're the best.
Great, thank you, Claire. Yeah, so good evening, good morning to everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm representing UK Sport here today. We signed up to the Sports for Climate Action in September 2022. For everyone's general awareness, UK Sport is an arm's length government body in the UK. We're responsible for leading high performance sport and enabling extraordinary moments that enrich lives. And we started looking at what generally social impact means to our organisation and how we could credibly play a role in that in 2020. And then that led us to really kind of deep dive into environmental sustainability and the role that we could and should be playing there since 2021.
Incredible. So just before we pass over to Ben, your sustainability strategy is now out, isn't it, even?
Yeah, we launched our first environmental sustainability strategy in March 2023, so 2 months ago.
Amazing. I'm excited to dig into that and share a little bit of the journey around how you got there with that as well as we go on. But Ben, let's pass over to you in terms of what are British Triathlon doing at the moment? Where are you at with the journey?
Thank you, and thanks for welcoming me to the panel and to this forum today. It's delighted to be involved and speak to our friends and cousins in Australia. We started our journey a long time ago, probably over 2 years ago now, and that was really spearheaded by our head Olympic coach Ben Bright, who's passionate about this area. We set up an internal working group, and I went about recruiting an external bunch of experts into a sustainability commission. I'll share more insight on that in due course, but I think some organisations, including UK Sport themselves, have accelerated past us in terms of pulling their strategy together and publishing it. We haven't yet published ours, still in draft format, but we're taking our time to do it right. We've also got limited capacity and resources to actually bring it to life. So we're doing a lot behind the scenes. We're doing a lot of stakeholder engagement, consultation, etc. But we are now at a stage where we're hoping to publish it over the coming months. And we've been a signatory of the UN Sport for Climate Action framework since April 2022. But we signed up to the previous iteration of that some way before that. So that's helped really combine us and provide some alignment across the organisation in that sphere of our strategy. But I look forward to sharing more as we talk further.
Amazing, thanks, Ben. So already I think you can see Evelyn and Ben, although making the same commitments and on the same path, quite a different journey so far. And Lindita, can we just come to you for again a short insight into kind of what signing up to the UN Sports for Climate Action framework means, and kind of if organisations do that, what the expectation is of them in terms of that, because we've heard very different journeys there, so it's not uniform, is it, when people join? Of then what happens?
Hi everyone, thanks Claire. Really delighted to be here. So yeah, I mean, for those of you who don't know, Sports for Climate Action framework was built with a consultation from a lot of sports organizations, and of course, Claire was accompanying us throughout that journey. But basically, what we did there is to follow two objectives, and one was to make sport more sustainable, looking at ways in which sport can walk the talk on climate. And then secondly, which is equally important, is to use the power of sports to drive influence, to drive change amongst global society. And so within that, initially we had a couple of principles that were quite broad. So asking organizations to embed environmental considerations in their business decisions, start a process to measure emissions, reduce them as much as possible, and then try to see how they could help reduction elsewhere for emissions that are not able to be reduced at this time because of the lack of solutions, etc. And then the other principles are really about educating for climate, about promoting sustainable consumption and production, and about communication. So as scientific knowledge became clearer, of course, there was also a clear need and a request by some signatories to try and see how we can put some targets behind this commitment so that we can actually try to understand a little bit better how can sport as a whole start to play their part, to be part of the solution, and then to be aligned with science. So for principle 2, then we started the consultation period to talk about whether we can put targets in place that would ask sports organizations to halve their emissions by 2030, and then try to see even a longer term goal, how can we really set the pace for climate action in the world and become net zero by 2040. Now, we had all sorts of organizations in our membership, as Claire mentioned, and I think as Evelyn and Ben mentioned before, we've got some really advanced organizations that have done their part in terms of understanding where their impact comes from, and they've developed strategies to reduce that or to really use that knowledge to engage their fans, their athletes, their communities. So there's a lot happening, but I think not at scale yet where we would like it to be. And then, of course, we have a lot of organizations that are really at the very beginning. So what we've done in the past is we've hosted a number of working groups to try and build that capacity a little bit. We think it is very important for sports organizations to learn from one another, and there's a good opportunity to do that under the framework. And then, of course, sometimes the level of commitments also differs, right? The requirements to when you sign Sports for Climate Action is that the top management is aware and really embeds that commitment throughout the organization. And what we're doing currently with Sports for Climate Action is, well, first of all, we're trying to find some help, some funding as well to help with some of the tools and strategies and guidance. Not 100 pages long documents, but really something very concrete and very practical. Of course, with the understanding that not every sport is the same. There's some really small sports organizations in terms of impact. Their impact would also be quite small. So we think focus there should be more on really engaging communities to do something on climate, because we do believe that climate conversation needs to be really in every living room, in every doorstep. We are in a climate emergency, and I think you would know much better than anybody else that the impacts are already here. So we don't really have to think about it as something that is a faraway concern, but there's really a good reason for why sports should engage in this. Number one, it is because it does affect the bottom line, right? There's no sports without safe climate. And I think it really talks straight into the resilience part of sports. So we have to be thinking about the future of sports we all love and we all enjoy. And it is our duty as well to use our voices and our microphones as much as possible to get the policymakers to do the right thing. Sport is not going to be able to solve the climate by itself, but I think sports' role is really to elevate that knowledge and awareness among society so that we all ask for the same things in a very constructive way. I think we don't want to be negative because the good news is that the science says we can still do this. And I think we are in a good place in terms of the awareness and where it is right now. But sometimes it is difficult for people to understand where to start. And I think you've covered that a little bit. So where do I start? This looks too big. This looks too complicated. But we really need to bring it down to the logical level to think that in order for us to make profit and to live better, we need functional ecosystems. And somehow we have managed to separate ourselves from ecosystems. And maybe if we look at indigenous communities, we can learn a lot from that part on how connected we need to be with the environment. Because at the end of the day, the air we breathe, the water we drink, everything comes from there. And we have to make sure that we see each other as one and not really as something separate. And the last thing I'd like to say is that we think, at least in the UN system, we're looking more into the social component of things as well, because we don't believe that we can do climate without really thinking about how can we educate people to do the right thing on climate. How can we remove that intimidation where people think it's too big, it means reduction, it means I have to do less, it means I have to enjoy life less. I think we have to look at the consumption element as well, but it's really critical to start thinking about how can we pass the knowledge that we have already, even the mistakes that we have made, as quickly as possible to people and to our community, so that we can do the same thing as quickly as possible. So I'll stop here, Claire, and happy to answer further questions.
Thank you so much. You're incredible, and it's so wonderful for everyone to hear that in terms of the importance of it, and where UN are coming from and where we're all coming from on this journey. So I'm sure that was really, really helpful. Thanks, Lindita. So in terms of next steps, just housekeeping point as well. If you have questions that you think of as people are talking, please drop them in the chat box and we'll come to them, as I said, after we've had a little discussion between ourselves. But if they pop into your head when people are chatting, pop them in the chat box and I'll have a look. And we'll ask those after the discussion. So in terms of sort of getting into it and making sure that this is helpful for you all, our understanding is if you're joining this call, you're probably you're obviously interested in climate and the environment from your sport, your NSO, and you're thinking this is probably, the right thing to do, we should be doing this, but are we there yet? There's these things that are worrying us, how do we get started? How are we going to go about this? So the first question I want to pose to you, Evelyn and Ben, is you're at different stages. So you both made commitments to UN Sports for Climate Action Framework. You've both made those reduction commitments to carbon, in terms of the reduction commitments of 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2040 for everyone as a reminder. So Ben, you're still working on the strategy that's due out soon. Even your strategies come out. Give everyone an insight, maybe 2 or 3 points from you both of like what you wish you'd done earlier in that journey, or what you are really glad you did do in terms of that. So when you're thinking about the journey, Ben, maybe come to you first because you haven't got to the strategy element yet, but you're still working behind the scenes, having made the commitment. What would you say are the key insights for people who are earlier on in this journey that you can share with them?
Sure, I'll be really candid with the group. When we signed up to it, we didn't even know how to measure and report our carbon emissions. We didn't have any resource to commit to a sustainability strategy, and we didn't have any expertise internally. But we knew across our executive team and our board that by making this commitment, it would galvanize us into working harder in this area. And we knew that it was strategically important. Not only is the right thing to do for our sport to protect the natural environment, etc., but our consumers, both of today and members of tomorrow, it would be the top, if not one of the top of their priority list. Also, given my wider role, I knew it is commercially important for us to be more active in this area. And I think that's one thing that organizations need to recognize, is that it's further some of Lindita's points, there's a need to do this, not only for the environment, but for sustainability of organizations, because we'll attract customers, members, and potentially commercial partners if we are seen, or not just seen, but if we have the right, let's call it ESG agendas at our heart and can help others deliver that in a more effective way than they might be able to do on their own. In terms of things I wish I knew at the time, perhaps that it isn't as burdensome as you might imagine. And actually, one great learning we had is just asking for help. The way that we recruit our sustainability commission, 90% of them are members of our organization and experts in their field, and we were blown away with the caliber of responses we had in that recruitment. Asked for help in the way that we did of UK sport, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So I think, you know, my two takeouts would be, go for it, even if you don't have the capacity and resources and all the questions answered. And secondly, ask for help.
Amazing, great insights, and I love that, and we'll get onto that a little bit more as well in terms of, I think when people contact us, and Lindita, I'm sure you know, we have the same where people contact us and say, you know, we're really into this, but we don't know that we can meet these commitments, and it's terrifying. So to hear from Ben that actually, you know, sometimes you just have to take the leap, and then that galvanizes you to then work out what that's going to look like. We hear a lot of organizations saying the same, because it is, you know, it's complicated, but it's simple. So that's brilliant, Ben. Amazing takeaways there. So Evelyn, what about you? You obviously, I've put the link to your sustainability strategy in the chat, so everyone has easy access to it and they can pore over that later. But tell us about your journey. What do you wish you knew at the start, and what can you share now that's going to help people?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Sorry, I should have been on that with sharing our link, really, shouldn't I?
I've got you.
Yeah, I might start with the positives, if that's all right first. I think something that we are really proud of through our process was that we really spent a long time listening, understanding and learning before we embarked on producing our own strategy. We knew that there were many others already ahead of us, and we didn't want to pretend that we were experts when we weren't. So we really did take the time. And when I say that, I think we spent 2 years listening and watching and hearing from others that were already ahead of us, so that we wouldn't make the same mistakes that they may have made. And then the other one is that you'll hear it time and time again, but stakeholder engagement and buy-in is just so crucial. And I think we understood that quite early on. So we really tried to prioritize that. And I think that really helped our strategy land as successfully as it did. And just to give one example, our strategy, the published version actually skips off 2 columns, which we have internally, which allocate every action in there to a specific department, and within that department, a specific person that is responsible. And each of those individuals co-created those actions, so they feel pure ownership over that action, and we can feel really confident that that will come to fruition. I guess on the negative, something that we don't have in our strategy that you might notice is we really would have liked to incorporate more on climate justice. And it would have been nice to take a combined approach with social sustainability. But unfortunately, we just focused on environmental sustainability because that's where our organisation is at this point. But you may notice our strategy is taking us through to 2025. So we're hoping that our next iteration of our strategy can broaden sustainability out a bit more and take in those climate justice and social elements.
Great. And I think that again is another thing we see. And Lindita, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on this as well. But you know, what we're seeing a lot of is people launching, making commitments and launching environmental sustainability strategies that do sort of separate out from social. And the reason we hear that a lot of the time is because in a lot of cases, the social pillar of sustainability is much further ahead around diversity, equity, and equality and accessibility and stuff. So I think there's no right or wrong. I'd say that would be a learn. There's no right or wrong. If you can integrate it with environmental and social governance, that's great. But you'll see a lot of organisations that are just putting out environmental sustainability strategies and focusing on that pillar. Have you got any thoughts on that, Lindita, just before I carry on with questions?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's really very hard to separate the two, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not just about climate. It is about people. It is about getting everybody to work together, to collaborate better. You know, we're talking here in the UN about radical collaboration, which means really collaborating with stakeholders that you have never spoken with before, because it is about really finding solutions to some of the challenging problems, finding solutions to things that we have not done before. So we don't know. That's why it's so important to initiate these conversations with the overall ecosystem. And as I mentioned, you know, when we speak about climate, really what it does say is that we have to be thinking about systems transformation. And what that means is we have to look at the social issues as well and address those. We have to look at the environmental problems and address those. And there, you know, you talk about nature, biodiversity, you talk about clean air, and everything that we do in terms of transport and land use and things we buy, things we use, things we throw away. So all these considerations have got to be made for a good and solid climate plan, right? You cannot just think, for example, as an organization or even as a company, that by putting some solar panels on the rooftop, you've done the job, right? It's so much more than that, because now what this does, what these challenges do to us, is that they make us think a bit long term. So that means that we cannot just be thinking about the year ahead or the 2 years ahead. And this is challenging, not just for governments, which have these 4-year cycles, right? But it's also about companies, because sometimes we ask companies to, we've started now this process where we're asking companies to give us their transition plan, for example. So tell us, how are you going to reduce emissions? How are your plans in the next 2 years, in the next 5 years? How much money are you going to spend on this? How are you involving everybody around you? How are you talking to your consumers, to your supply chain? You know, in what way are you engaging them so that you can build the right strategy? And I think we see that struggle a lot, where people say, well, we don't operate like that. So that is exactly the issue. We have got to change the way we are operating in. And again, the good news is we should not aspire to do this by ourselves. It is so important to talk to one another and to be a little bit more bold in you know, asking for help as well. But as Ben mentioned, I think what we're seeing with some of our signatories is when they have this holistic strategy, when people are really clear about what they're doing, so not really some you know, big words that mean nothing. When you look really in the substance, there's not much. I think we have to be thinking holistically. And if we do that, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of companies and others who are willing to put money into such strategies. So when I say radical collaboration with non-traditional stakeholders, I mean that we are seeing from some of our signatories that they are getting help, financial help or sustainability help, by actors who have never been interested in that type of sport, but because of their purpose, because they're being out loud about what they want to do and where they want to go, they are driving a little bit of a more interest to see how can we help that and how can we push for that. So really it is a collective effort, and we have to see it as such. We have to start talking a little bit more. We cannot underestimate the impact of maybe sometimes, you know, some WhatsApp messages that you share around with your friends. So you start from there, really. It doesn't have to be straight into the technicalities of it, but it's really by having these conversations and learning from each other on all these things.
Amazing, thank you. And so there's 2 points there I want to pick up with you, Ben and Evelyn. So the first one about the collaboration, you know, and understanding, I think it'd be great for people to hear how you as a national body and then as a federation are working together to advance environmental sustainability strategies. So I want to come to you on that. And then before I forget, also, Lindy mentioned there of, you know, yes, the carbon reduction emissions element is important, but the elements beyond that as well that aren't just about carbon are also critical. So I want to hear from you both about elements that outside of sort of carbon that you're thinking about or adding into your sustainability strategy. But let's come to the first one in terms of collaboration between your organisations. How is that manifesting?
Yeah, maybe I can give some backgrounds in terms of how I went about it, and then Evelyn can maybe share in terms of how we formalised it to break it down. So I guess I reached out to Evelyn's colleagues some years ago just to see how they could support. And at the time, UK Sport was essentially reorganising and reshaping its approach to social impacts and the whole strategy in that space, of which environmental sustainability would be one key strand. So we were speaking with UK Sport quite openly and transparency of what support or funding there could be to support us and other sports organisations with similar, with a similar look and feel. We have an alliance through our CEO network of across the swim, bike and run national governing bodies, and we essentially put together a little picture proposal with UK Sport support about how some investment could help us take the sustainability strategies forward as a collective alliance. And we had that conversation ongoing for at least 6 months. At that time, UK Sport were developing their own approach to this area in terms of program support. So we were earmarked as essentially a pilot program within that. And perhaps now I'll pass over to Evelyn, who can share the next phase of that in terms of how it matured and how it was finalised.
Yeah, so I might just give a bit more of the background that was going on from UK Sports side at that point in time. So when we eventually did our footprint, emissions footprint, because of our nature, we are a funding body. We invest national lottery and government funds. When we did that emissions breakdown, we realized that 94% of our emissions were actually attributable to those that we fund and not in our direct control. So we excluded that from our boundary, at least for this first footprint. But that really highlighted to us the importance that we couldn't just ignore that we have some responsibility to where that money is going and the carbon emissions that that's contributing to. So there was a real feel that we have a duty to the sector to do better for them and support them. And so we planned to support our NGBs in some way. And I guess Ben came to us quite early at a time when we were going through that thought process. So as he said, they became perfect pilot opportunity for that NGB support. And we basically recruited a consultancy to take that group of NGBs on the initial steps of their environmental sustainability journey. And basically what that means in layman's terms is getting their emissions footprint, at least for a baseline year, and also developing an action plan towards decarbonisation and hopefully including some of those additional elements that you're referring to, Claire, as well.
I'm on mute. Brilliant. So, I mean, that's really helpful, I think, hopefully, with organisations on sort of more in Ben's perspective of being a sort of equivalent NSO to understand how they might interact with organisations in Australia, Sport Australia or others that maybe are in a similar vein to Evelyn and UK Sport, because that's it. To Lindita's point, there has to be this collaboration, and especially we do work within an ecosystem in sport. So it might be that in your journey that you want to make those inquiries about how you can collaborate more as well. So let's come on to the second element then about, beyond the carbon, where the indicators most organized sports organizations look at around energy, transport, waste, food, water, etc. There's the carbon element, but beyond that for you both, even from your strategy and Ben, in terms of your way of thinking at the moment, what other elements are you considering within sustainability beyond the sort of carbon emissions? Whoever's
Sure. So
to jump in.
we haven't published this yet, but our strategy essentially falls into 3 pillars. The carbon emissions, carbon reduction being one. Secondly, it's about clean water and natural environment. Many organisations will talk about the natural environment, but obviously, given the nuances of our sport, swimming in open water, lakes, rivers, sea, having clean water is critical, and it's been a big issue over recent years, sewage and pollution in waters in particular. And thirdly, it's about responsible consumption and production. Triathlon can be quite an equipment heavy sport across the 3 disciplines. So they're the 3 pillars that we're looking at. And the way that we came to those 3 pillars is, we did some detailed consultation, both with our internal staff and some more widely external stakeholders, which were led by some of the experts in our commission, where we aligned our kind of rationale and activities as a sport against the UN Sustainable Development Goals And I think one reflection I had throughout the process is that there's a huge irony here with sport. We are naturally and historically quite good at developing some of the wide aspects of sustainability in the UN Sustainability Development Goals, be that gender equity, be that education, be that some of the wider equality and diversity goals, given the community and development programs that we run. But we don't traditionally associate those with sustainability in the more holistic sense. Vice versa, sport is reliant on having a clean, healthy, safe, sustainable, thriving natural environment and a healthy planet, but we've been very poor at recognizing the importance of that to our strategy, you know, historically. So there's this kind of contradiction in terms of what sport is traditionally good at versus what it needs to be good at to retain its environment that we do our sports in. And I think having a holistic view of sustainability, even if our strategy is essentially split in two, we have an ED&I strategy and a more environmentally focused strategy, having that holistic sense of sustainability, I think is critical to the success of what we do in this space across the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've had a private question about the SDGs as well, which I'll come back to because you touched on that there, Ben. I think that's really helpful. And Lindita, I want to come to you on that. But Evelyn, from your side, from, you know, beyond the carbon elements, what would you say are the key areas outside of that sort of carbon reduction that you've prioritized within your sustainability strategy?
Yeah, so exactly the same as Ben, to be honest. We framed our strategy around the SDGs of climate action, responsible consumption and production, and life below water and life on land, which is kind of the biodiversity element. If you look through our strategy, they're not overtly referenced that much, I wouldn't say, but you could allocate them all if you wanted to. And I think just drawing out on biodiversity, we've got a particular action in there, which is around the UN Sports for Nature initiative and how we could use that to understand our role, our major events role, and NGB's role in ecosystem restoration and biodiversity conservation. And as I said earlier, this, what we're calling like a foundational strategy, is only taking us through to 2025. So there are a few actions in this strategy like that one where it's very much, we're appreciating that we still have to explore this area and we're not quite sure what our role will be that we're going to play in there yet. But we're committing to doing some work to understand that.
Nice. That's brilliant. So just a reminder for everyone, if you have questions, pop them in the chat because we will have time to come to them. If you're feeling as though you want to ask me, put it into me privately in the chat and I can ask it anonymously, that's no problem as well. Although there are no silly questions, there are no bad questions, but do feel free to do that if you wish. Before we come to that, Lindita, from your perspective, is there ways that you recommend sports organisations intersect with the SDGs compared to, you know, obviously UN Sports for Climate Action Framework has the principles, it's kind of been put together specifically for sports organisations, and the SDGs are obviously broad and used across all business. What are the, you know, is the, even if it's not a direct recommendation, but is there thoughts about how sport should consider that in this journey?
Absolutely, Claire. I think, you know, we've got to be following these two blueprints, right? The Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, which are basically giving us a way forward for how we can ensure that the future will be safe. And I think sometimes, you know, all the SDGs, at least what I hear from sports organizations I talk to sometimes, is that it's just a bit overwhelming. There's so many of them. Where do you start? How do you do it? And I think because these sports organizations sit in different places, they have different goals, different areas, I think best would be to really look at that and take on a couple of SDGs that they think they can best influence, or where they think that they can address the biggest impact that they may have as an organization. I think it's better to spend more time on things that will deliver more results than on things that are really small and will not make a big difference. So I think it is important to really look at some of the things. But for example, if you look at health as one of the SDGs, of course, there's a lot that sports can talk about it in many ways. But at the same time, then you've got the situation where if you're not dealing with climate action, then you are kind of indirectly hurting that sustainable development goals you are in the first place helping. So I think it's really goes back to that kind of a holistic approach again, to try and see as an organization, let us understand where our biggest impact is. And let us understand also based on that, what can we do ourselves? And where do we need to push the governments? Where do we need to push our cities? And how do we use our community, our fan base, our stronger voices to have those conversations started in the city or in the region, etc. So I think it's really about, first of all, understanding where that biggest impact is, figuring out a framework on how are you going to address it, mapping stakeholders that you're going to have to start initiating these conversations, and then together providing for that united front to really go with messages to the policymakers and others as well. And there's a lot of opportunities to do that. There's events. What we're looking at in Sports for Climate Action as well is to try and come up with some sort of a global statement from sports organizations, a call to policymakers that they will need to be more ambitious and they would need to be more bold. So if we look at the current commitments right now, there's not much to say. I mean, the future does not seem bright, but of course, there's so many reasons to be optimistic because we are in a situation where people are understanding much more that we have to do this. We are in a situation where solutions exist. I mean, and there's really no reason why not to think a little bit more about these issues. Again, my plea to everyone is not to think of it as something that you will have to do in addition and, oh my God, this is another PR exercise. It's not. It's really about looking inside at your operations and thinking, do we need to do this? Can we do this better? Do we have we considered these issues with an environmental and social lens or not? And if not, what can we do better here? How can we use local goods and services better instead of, having to fly goods and services from different places? So I think it's really going down to a very basic level. And the good thing is that once you are in a sustainability journey, there's no turning back. You cannot go back because then it feels morally wrong, right? So once you are there and you start understanding things, I think that the action will flow, and that's where we need to get everybody to.
Thank you. Definitely. But just Lindita mentioned in that intervention, and then Ben also mentioned before about the kind of targets and in terms of reducing your impact in meeting the targets. Ben, you mentioned that when you signed up, you didn't know how you were going to meet them, and Evelyn, you haven't mentioned yet, but I'd love to hear from you both just in that idea of, once you're committing, not turning back, as Lindita said, but also we see people that it becomes part of their ethos and their drive and part of their business, and it all ties in together. So would you say now how exactly you're going to meet the targets for 50% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2040 as you're further along in the journey? Evelyn, I come to you first on that. And by the way, this is not a trick question because I'm highlighting this because, as Lindita mentioned about sport coming together to lobby other areas, there's big areas like transport, etc., that are difficult for sport, and we're all aware of that. So over to you, Evelyn, on thoughts around that, about meeting those targets.
Well, no, Claire, is the short answer.
I knew it was going to be the answer. Everyone's answer is the same.
But this is exactly, it's a collective problem, and I think we're all looking to solve it together. And I think that's part of the beauty of the Sports for Climate Action, because it's a peer group of everyone that's like-minded on this journey to improve the sustainability of sport. And if there's any way we're going to come to solutions, it's through that group of all these great organizations with that drive. What I would say is that it is actually quite normal and standard practice for businesses to set targets and not know how to meet them. I think people get especially scared about doing it with environmental sustainability because they fear it could transpire as greenwashing. But if you kind of look at it in the same way that other business targets are set, I don't think it's crazy that you kind of set the target and then you work out how you're gonna reach it. And obviously, how we all know the key way to do that, and as specified in Sports for Climate Action, is that you start by measuring and then you learn where your biggest hitters are, and then that's when you can do a more targeted approach to how you're going to hit those targets. So that it's almost, you kind of have to go through that process. It would be inefficient for you to just guess how you're going to do it before you've done that proper research and data collection anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we liken it in a lot of conversations with setting the targets and not knowing exactly how you're going to get there or the way that's going to work to, we're in a perfect industry to talk about this. How many athletes set a target of getting an Olympic gold? They know they're going to work hard and commit every day to doing that, but they don't know. But you have to set the target, and then that's what your North Star is to drive that action. And that's, again, it's just a great parallel with sport from an organizational perspective of winning a tournament, winning a gold, whatever it is. Set that North Star, and then that will inform all of your decision making and keep you focused on that as you go forward. Ben, what about you in terms of those targets?
Yeah, I'll be honest, still don't know how we're going to meet it. We are investing in that kind of resource through the collaboration with the UK Sport Programme that we're part of, to really come up with a robust reduction mitigation plan, etc. I think the critical challenge that we and many other sports face is around international travel. You know, our international athletes particular can't just not travel to go to international events. But that's where I think our lobbying and influence is important, because we can work with our partners in international federation level and other federations to influence the schedule so that it is more efficient from an environmental perspective and athlete travel perspective. I think the other challenge we have is that we don't have a set field of play. A lot of our facilities are rented or temporary. So there is a huge flexibility in terms of how we go about measuring our carbon footprint based on what's in scope and what's out of scope. And we're just finalising that at the moment. I think the critical thing for me, as you pointed out, Claire, is to really align behind a North Star. And it's better to hit 90% of that target than to not embark on hitting that target at all. And that is, I think, something that we can play an important role in. I think the second point I'd like to make is the work we can do in influencing our stakeholders, members, customers, etc., on their behaviours. So things that might not necessarily be in scope for our organisation, but are in scope for our sphere of influence, are critically important. So the things in our control we might have limited impact on because they are relatively small. The things outside of our immediate control, but where we have more influence, is our areas where we can have greater impact. And that's why I think the voice of sports organisations, the voice of our athletes, and the voice of the sports movement in general is really powerful one, and one that we should leverage collectively as well as individually.
Agreed. That's an awesome call to arms. Get behind this, absolutely. I'm going to keep the recording going. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, but I think I'll funnel them through, and I think we can keep the recording going, so that other people who listen to this after the fact can learn as well. So Evelyn, I've got one from you, from Hockey Australia. He says, Evelyn, you spoke about stakeholder buy-in as important to the success of your strategy launch. Do you have examples or activities of stakeholder engagement that you delivered during your journey? And was there any pushback or negativity from the community as you went about that, I guess, the stakeholder engagement actions?
Yeah. So I'd say there's two sides to this. There's external and there's internal. So externally, we ran a stakeholder consultation, which was basically a survey just trying to scope everyone's thoughts. Like, we wanted to get their appetite around environmental sustainability, and then more practically where they stand and what they feel they can do or can't do. And then we also did a similar consultation with athletes, which actually covered more holistically social impact, but there was definitely an environmental sustainability element there. And then internally, we had like a very draft version of our strategy that got approved by board in May last year, so nearly a year before we actually released our strategy. And opposite to pushback, we had a bit of a weird thing with them where they actually wanted us to be more ambitious. They were really pushing us to go even further, and if anything, it was us that were pushing back and saying, this feels unrealistic, I'm not sure we would. But we got really lucky there that our internally we already had a lot of buy-in from the outset. I think that we really pride ourselves on being a leadership body, and I think that they didn't want to deny the opportunity to be a leader in this element as well.
Yeah.
In other terms of actual pushback, more externally, is just always the case in our sector, is just lack of resource, and that's time and money. We're obviously always extremely stretched, and we didn't actually really get much pushback in terms of the desire and the feeling that we need to do this as a sector, but just more, how can we, with time and the money that we have, given all the other things that we need to be considering and working on. And all of this is, you need that bedrock of athlete success for any of this to have that voice and that platform anyway. So it's just always a case of competing priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. We hear that across the board. I'd say that the challenges that the majority of sport faces in this area that we hear time and again are time, resource, money, expertise and communications. They're the ones that come up all the time, but although they are challenges, they're not insurmountable challenges. And again, as you're both showing, when you've made those commitments and you have that buy-in, then those challenges are overcome, because as you mentioned, that great word of like a bedrock, or a bedrock or a North Star of what you're pushing towards. So that's awesome. Just another question to you both about how, Ben, you sort of spoke about this a little bit before, but maybe we can delve in a bit deeper about how you both addressed using your sphere of influence. So sort of thinking about not just what you can do yourselves, but also then what you could do with partners, how can you what you can do as influencers. Did you think about that all together in terms of your influence over different sectors, or did you go about it slightly differently in terms of thinking of those spheres of influence that you have as an organisation? And I guess, Ben,
Sure.
we could come to you first. Could you start talking about that a bit?
Yeah, I think it's really important to identify who your stakeholders are, but also who your allies are, in terms of actually building a robust agenda and programme to push forward. We've had some fantastic support from the local city councils that we work with, who have their own sustainability agendas, and we've dovetailed into those around the hosting of our major international events. Again, that's something that we've taken as a given for many years, and we haven't really championed it that much, but we work with Leeds City Council around some of their efforts to reduce waste, promote recycling, and reduce carbon footprint around the hosting of our World Triathlon Championship Series race year on year. We've also worked hand in hand with World Triathlon. We were awarded the first gold award for sustainability at our event in Leeds last year, but we were also part of their consultation process in helping to pull together that accreditation process, given the work that we did in Leeds year on year. There's obviously other obvious ones, other event organisers, clubs, commercial partners, etc. But I think the key thing is to identify those that can actually accelerate your strategy and offer support for your strategy, not only the ones that are, on your long list of stakeholders. On the commercial side, we will increasingly look at our governance around commercial deals in terms of bringing on board the partners which align with our values. And we have a robust governance framework which we go through with my commercial committee to ensure that the partners we bring on board are robust from an ESG perspective. And we have some guidelines to measure that and benchmark against. And we hope to secure in due course a partner more specifically aligned to amplify our sustainability agenda and how that meets with theirs, in the same way that we do with diversity and inclusion or gender equity mixed relays. So there's lots to talk about there. I think the one other key area is just working with our athletes, but it may be something that Evelyn can talk about in more length, given the great work that UK Sport are doing on this across the sector, not just with ourselves.
Yeah, Evelyn, over to you.
Yeah, on spheres of influence, I guess we've took a very similar approach to the International Olympic Committee, and we've included a very similar diagram to them in our strategy, which is basically that us, an organisation, is in our control, but it's got the least impact. And particularly because in the UK, we're not public facing, we're very much kind of just that enabler that sits behind our NGBs and our major events who are public facing. So we've got us, an organisation, as I say, and we were really aware that we can't possibly be asking our NGBs and our major events to work on environmental sustainability if we're not demonstrating how we can do that ourselves. So we really call this walking the walk, and that was really important to us that we prioritise that. In saying that, we felt we couldn't wait for us to walk the walk before starting action on our wider influences. We just don't have that liberty of time at this point. As Lindita said, we're in a climate emergency here and we all need to be taking action now. So then our next two spheres of influence are NGBs and major events. And as I say, these are a bit more public facing. They have a louder voice and platform in at least UK society and potentially internationally. And so our role there is really to support them and enhance and amplify their work and help them to be progressing on the environmental sustainability agenda in the way that we really want the UK to be. And then our final sphere of influence is voice and platform. And as I say, we're not public facing, so this is where we have least control, but we're really keen to do our bit to bolster that voice and platform of high performance sport in the UK, and particularly in the area of environmental sustainability. And I will admit we've kind of deprioritized that initially. That's something that we're exploring at the moment. We've got a big piece of work at the moment around fan engagement and what that looks like and how we can credibly work in that area. So our plan of attack on that one will come out hopefully in the next year.
Wonderful. I'm conscious of time. We are going to time out in just a few minutes. So just to finish off, I think I want a final word from each of our panelists or speakers in just like 10 or 20 seconds of like, it's just a call to arms, a call to action or advice of just how to get going. So I want to hear from you all on that. From my side, my parting words are just about the fact that there's a whole international community here that are really open. I think that the biggest thing for me is the sport and sustainability community are the least competitive part of sport. Everyone is so open to sharing. If you're on this call and you're thinking this all sounds great, but now what? You know, Martin's there to help. We're here to help. Sport Environment Alliance are here to help. Basis, I saw Russ on the call, the British Association of Sustainable Sport are here. There's all of these global counterparts who are here to help you on this journey, as well as people like Evelyn and Ben, who so kindly give their time to share their story and try and support more action as well. So please don't forget that you're not alone in this, and we're all here to help. So come to us for those questions. So I'm going to pass to all of our speakers for a final word, and then Martin, over to you to close us out. So Ben, final word to the good people who've joined us today.
Yeah, a final word would be, engage with your stakeholders, consumers, customers, survey, ask them what they think. And secondly, ask for help, both from the wider community and your internal community, because you'll be surprised of what you'll receive.
Thank you. Evelyn?
I'd say there's nothing like galvanizing action than putting a target out there and committing yourself publicly to something, and then you can be held account publicly, and that really galvanizes action better than anything else.
Amazing. Thank you. Lindita?
Yes, well, I guess if you're a sports organization or anybody working with sports, then I guess if you haven't signed onto the Sports for Climate Action, then the question is why, right? We have to become part of the solution. We must do so. In particular, sports, have a particular role to play there. Around influence and around bringing others along in the journey. So I think we have to leverage that role as successfully as possible. There's lots of support out there in the UN climate change. As a convention, there's only so much we can do given all the challenges that we have to address, but we are there to support as much as possible. We do create those spaces for free and open conversation. We very often say, I have no idea how to do this in these calls, but it's more about, okay, well, who knows something about this? Can we get external expertise then to come in and help us do this? And I think beyond commitment, which, as was mentioned, is the first step, one of the key things is to proceed with action as quickly as possible. There's always something you can do, and all of us can do. The question to ask ourselves is, are we doing enough as individuals and as organizations? And I believe the question is probably not enough. So I think we should really start playing with those questions internally in our organizations as quickly as possible. So thank you, Claire, for having me, and thanks everyone.
Wise words from Lindita. So that's it from us. I just want to throw to Martin to close us out of the session. So Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for everybody else. I just took away a couple of quick things. I think Lindita was really talking about take action now, sign up and be part of the movement moving forward. Ben inspired me to an old comment I remember hearing years ago by the founder of the Olympics, Brandon Corbetton. It's not about winning, it's about taking part. And we need to start taking part now to make the difference. And it's not only by ourselves, as Evelyn said. If we actually reach out and talk to people, they'll help us co-design it, and the support network is there. And Claire, you're the ultimate connector, and I can't wait to see you down at the NSC and the National Sports Environment Conference in July. I have put a link in there for everybody with a discount code if you sign up in the next few days and benefit from that. So thank you everybody for joining us. It's only the start of the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Have great evenings in Australia. We look forward to seeing you all soon. All the best.
Thank you. Bye.